Chapter 7 Iconoclasm. Once they were all together in the upper room, and Abram had gained mastery of himself, they were all summoned to sit down and begin the feast. The table of the house was several low tables settled in a U shape around the central couch, with smaller couches indicating the seats about the table. Terah sat at the head of the table, the bar of the U that joined both sides together, directly opposite the center couch. To his right was the honored seat, usually reserved for guests and visiting dignitaries of high esteem. Abram sat at his father's right, and Haran, much to his dismay, sat at his left. To Abram's right sat Amthalo, and to Haran's left sat his son Lot. Besides them sat Nahor. The ladies sat beneath their canopy in the central couch of the table. The servants brought in the food and wine for the feast. Abram saw before him the most decadent food he had ever seen. The house of Terah was fabulously wealthy, and could afford exquisite meats that the common folk had to do without. Animals of all kinds were smoked, baked, broiled, roasted, and stewed in every delectable fashion, after the tastes of Ur. Terah had spared no expense in the feast of his son. The juice of grapes and barley were distributed freely among their cups, until all of them bore wine or beer within. When all was at last done, Terah rose from his place, his golden cup in his hand, and commanded his family to rise with him. "Today," he said, "we welcome the return of my son, Abram, to our home. Let us give thanks to the Khaldi for his return. Praise be to Khaldi, who has ordained the way of princes. Praise be to Tesheba, who has withheld the bow of storm from striking him down. Praise be to Shivani, who has guided his steps on his long journey back to our house." All those about repeated the praises to the Khaldim, all except Abram. He alone did not stir himself to praise these idols heretofore named. He was still wary at the wine, having remembered the tale of Noah, and how he had been shamed by Ham and the loss of the skins thereby, and did not drink. But even had that not been his part, the names of these false gods made him angry. The rest of his family drank and poured out a portion to the gods upon the ground. But Abram remained in his seat. His refusal did not go unnoticed by his father Terah. "Abram, my son, you seem perplexed," he said. "Is the feast not to your liking? Has the welcome been lacking?" "No, my lord," Abram returned. "I only object to the naming of these gods." Terah chuckled. "What is this? My son does not worship the gods." "I regard only the eternal God, creator of heaven and earth, who made the sons of men upon the earth." All eyes turned to Abram as tense, awkward silence fell upon the banquet party. From behind the veil in the central couch, Sarai looked upon Abram intently. Never had she heard anything new in all her long years living in the city of Ur, and this God that Abram mentioned was the first new thing that she had heard in a great long time. "What are you saying, my son?" Terah asked. "Behold, those who made us are here, within the godhouse. Haran, show your younger brother the godhouse, that he may look upon the gods whom we serve." "What of the feast, my lord father?" Haran asked. "Take some of the meat to offer before the gods," Terah replied. "Perhaps they will forgive my second son's folly, and save our feast from ill fortune." Haran rose, and dismissed himself from the feast, then took Abram by the hand, and led him from the upper room. As they were leaving, he ordered the servants to bring savory meat from their feast, and bring it to them in the godhouse. Down a corridor and turning left, they entered a chamber in the estate of Terah that was the godhouse. 12 large statues dominated the most revered places in the room, with hundreds of smaller idols of wood and stone sitting in little groups or apart by themselves on stone altars or in alcoves carved into the walls. Chief among these was Khaldi, the god of kings in Ur. A very tall statue of stone, seated upon a throne that lifted him above the other statues in the room. A heavy smell of incense filled the room, and the smoke thereof lingered about the heads of the statues, creating a mystical effect that enchanted the eye and enraptured the senses of those who entered the godhouse. "Behold, little brother," Haran said, a hint of pride within his voice. These are the ones which made everything that you see upon the earth. You, I, our exalted Father, and all of mankind. Behind them there came the servants, bringing on a silver platter the best and most savory parts of the meat from the feast. These they placed on a wooden table that was set up before the statue of Khaldim. Our king, the great Nimrod, may he live forever, Haran stated, is high priest of the Khaldim. As our great example, the man is lord and priest of his house before the gods. Our father Terah was himself a priest in his day, as the eldest son. I am the priest now. Behold, I shall entreat the gods on your behalf. Once the meat was presented, Haran knelt before the statues of the gods. With his hands raised up, he looked as though welcoming in some spirit into his body. He then spoke aloud in reverential tones. O Khaldim, gods of Ur, he prayed, hail to thee who breaks the power of kings and brings them under our lord Nimrod. Hail to thee who holds power over the storms. Hail to thee who brings life and fertility to the children of men. Hear us, and receive this our sacrifice of flesh, in honor of your greatness, and show your favor upon this my brother Abram. But in all of this, Abram was not cowed or awed. He looked at the statues as only larger forms of the little ones his mother had in the cave, so fragile, so easily broken. It seemed silly in his eyes to worship something so fragile, and yet here was his older brother making a fool of himself by prostrating himself before a large chunk of rock. In the awkward silence after his brother's prayer, the mind of Abram was spurred on to speak. No word, he spoke. No movement. Nothing. They don't even reach out to eat the meat we gave to them. Maybe we're not doing it right? Maybe they weren't pleased with the meat we gave them? Maybe it's not enough for them? Maybe we should come back tomorrow with better meat. Maybe they'll be satisfied then. How dare you mock the gods? Haran retorted, rising in anger and turning to face his brother. How many prayers have your gods answered? Abram asked. How many times have your gods spoken to you? Tell me if you know. If so, then I shall retract what I have said. But if not, why do you rage against me? Haran sputtered angrily at his brother, unable to answer him. His hands flexed over and over, as though he would strike him. But Abram did not flinch. More than a time or two, when he was a teenager, he had said or done something to incur the wrath of Noah, and nothing his brother could do could compare to the rage of an ancient giant that had braved the wrath of the giants in the time before the flood. For this reason, he was quick to correct his behavior and rarely angered or disobeyed Noah afterwards. You will live to regret those words, Haran retorted. The gods will curse you for this blasphemy. Let them, Abram retorted with a sly smile. The Eternal shall do so and more to me if I don't rid your house of these idols in 3 days' time. In a fury, Haran left the godhouse. Abram did not leave just yet, but lingered yet behind. With a look of disgust, he turned his gaze to the idols in the godhouse. How could someone worship something like this? Into his mind came the remembrance of all of what he had seen and heard in the house of Noah. These gods were created things, crafted by hands. Who in their right minds would worship something that had been made, and was thus under the power of its maker? He returned to the feast, and there they ate in silence, unwilling to talk about what had happened beforehand. None of them spoke a word to each other, until at last the feast was over. The servants cleared away the tables, and the families went to their rooms. Abram was given a room with a view of the city. At his insistence, his staff was brought into his room and placed against the door inside the room. He was still unaccustomed to having servants at chateaus do his bidding for him. He had pulled his own weight in the house of Noah. As the night was falling upon the city of Ur, much as it had an evening some 50 years ago, Abram was now in his room, dressing himself in his own clothes. His new clothes were unfamiliar to him, too exposing for his tastes. While he wrapped his cloak around him, there was a knock at the door. I don't need anything, thank you, Abram replied. You've already seen to my needs 7 times over. It's Sarai, a woman's voice spoke from the other side of the door. Immediately, Abram rose to his feet, his attention aroused to the one on the other side of the door. For a moment he hesitated, enraptured as he was by the sheer melody of her voice. He hadn't heard her speak before at the feast, and now that she spoke, it filled him with awe and happiness. "May I enter?" Sarai asked. "Oh, yes, of course," Abram replied. The door was opened, and into his room there appeared Sarai. She was dressed as she had been at the banquet, yet now her hair was tied back with many golden clasps, revealing more of her shoulders. The way the little oil lamps in Abram's room illuminated the soft skin of her shoulders made them glow and glisten. It was not of any help to Abram's concentration. "Do not tell my lord father that I came here," Sarai began. "I only wish to see you in private and to ask something." "What would you know, my lady?" Abram asked. Sarai hid her blushing face at his words, turning aside and pretending to pace the floor of the room to obscure her face from the light of the lamps. "I would know more of this god of yours," Sarai stated. "I've never heard of him before." "What would you know about him?" Abram asked. "What is his name?" Sarai asked. "What?" Abram asked. It seemed an absurd notion to him. "He is the Eternal One, Almighty God, creator of heaven and earth." "These aren't names, those are titles," Sarai replied. "You mean to tell me that you worship a god with no name?" "If he has a name," Abram replied, "then he has not revealed it to me." "Where is his temple?" Sarai asked. "Who are his priests?" "The earth could not be large enough to hold a temple worthy of his glory. As for his priests, I know not. I fear no one knows about the eternal God." "Except for you?" Sarai asked. "And the house of Noah," Abram added. "A legend?" Sarai chuckled. "You don't believe in Noah?" Abram asked. "Oh, he's known," Sarai replied. "They say he weaves fantastic stories of giants and monsters from a time beyond memory. But they are merely stories, fanciful things to tell children before bed." At this she paused, a tense expression upon her face. "But what if there's more to those stories?" Abram asked. "What if they're real?" "It would be a marvelous thing indeed," Sarai stated. "For as long as I could remember, my lord father and our grandfather have prayed to the gods morning, noon, and night. How wonderful it would be if one of them spoke back to us." She sighed. "Something troubles you?" Abram asked. "It's nothing," she dismissed, shaking her head. "So, you do not know the name of your eternal God, nor do you know of any temple or priest that worships him? If you don't mind me asking, how do you know that this God of yours even is?" "I have seen the Ark of Noah in the wilderness," Abram retorted. "So has the great king," Sarai stated, "yet he does not believe." "I have heard the different languages of the peoples of the earth," Abram added. "I have also heard how that came about." At this, Sarai strode across the room and placed her hand dangerously close to Abram's lip in a gesture of silence. "Shh! Do not speak of such things so loudly," she whispered. "We do not speak of Babel openly. It is unwise to do so. The king's wrath would be roused against whoever spoke of it openly or in private. Their lives would be forfeit." "I do not fear in this regard," Abram stated. "You are a fool not to fear the king," Sarai returned, removing her hand from his lips. "Must we indeed be silent on matters of this Tower of Babel?" Abram asked, gesturing towards the window. Now bathed in darkness, but only a few hours ago it could be seen from afar off, half constructed, rising like a great stone mountain out of the midst of the plain. "Behold, all eyes can see the tower from here, yet we must not speak of it?" "We speak as the king wishes," Sarai said, averting her gaze. "And there ends the matter." "Not for me," Abram shook his head. "I would speak of the eternal even if it cost me my life." "Would you indeed?" Sarai asked. "Would you defy the great King Nimrod and all of his might for the sake of your nameless god, one whose temple or priest you have never seen?" "Yes," Abram nodded. "Why?" she asked. "I have faith that the eternal is," Abram said. There was something in his voice that bespoke of strength, a strength beyond the passions of his body, aroused as they were by the fair lady before him. The words that he spoke had some effect on Sarai as well, for she took a step away from him, as if in reverence. "Forgive me," she spoke. "I was mistaken. I have now seen with my own eyes a priest of the eternal God. You are to be commended for your faith, my lord." "Do you still not believe?" Abram asked. Sarai sighed. "I have heard many priests equivocate endlessly about the might of the gods. They at least have the wind and rain to point to as the work of their gods, and images of wood and stone made in their likeness. Your faith may be enough for you, my lord, but not for me. I need something more. Something greater than the powers of the earth and sky to show the truth of your words and the power of your God." With that, Sarai dismissed herself and left Abram's room. Abram went to his bed, said a prayer to the Eternal, asking his forgiveness that he had been in a house of false gods, and that he give him the strength to stand for him without fear in the days to come. On the morning of the next day, Abram arose before everyone else in the house, save the servants. He was always up before the rising of the sun every morning. All the chores he had to do in the house of Noah needed to be done before the sun rose and it was time to lead the sheep and goats into the hills. He was still surprised with the servants waiting on him and dressing him for him. He had always dressed and groomed himself every morning when he arose. But they were not wholly needless. He asked one of them to fetch him an axe and leave it outside the god-house that evening. Once he was dressed, he made his way down to the god-house, where he saw Haran waiting for him. With him were 2 servants with savory meat. As Haran had said, their mother Amthello had prepared it at his request, but Terah knew nothing of this. Together they entered the god-house once again, and Haran placed the offering on the table before the large statue of Khaldim. Once more he made the same petition as he had before, and once again there was awkward silence. "Perhaps they are busy with godlike business in Terah," Abram stated. "Perhaps they are offended by the presence of an unbeliever," Haran retorted, seething between his gritted teeth. "Unbeliever?" Abram asked. "I am not an unbeliever. Let them speak in recognition of this gift. Let their ears hear your prayers, and let their hands reach out and eat of this meat that we give to them, and then I shall believe." "That's not the way it works," Haran hissed. "Why is it not?" Abram asked. "Are these not your gods? You light candles to them, yet they do not see them. You say prayers to them, yet they do not answer you. You offer food and drink to them, yet they do not eat or drink that which is offered to them." "Do not embarrass our Lord Father again," Haran warned. "Very well, I shall not embarrass him at all," Abram responded. "Return to our Lord Father and tell him that I remain in the god-house to see his gods, if they will answer me. If they answer me, then all shall be well." Haran frowned at his brother, and then returned to leave the god-house. Abram, meanwhile, sat down in the midst of the god-house before the great statue of Khaldim. It seemed so little in his eyes, this giant piece of stone, and yet given so much reverence by people who could just as easily throw it to the ground and break it. So much fuss for something so fragile. All day he sat in the god-house, staring up at the large statue, and eyeing each of the smaller ones in turn. Yet in all the many long hours of watchfulness, not one of them stirred. Sometime around the evening, he heard footsteps outside the god-house. Turning about, he saw the servant with the axe in his hand. "I am here, master," he said. "I have the axe as you requested." Abram nodded, and then rose from his place, taking the axe from the servant and dismissing him. As soon as the servant's footsteps disappeared down the hall, Abram turned towards the statues, an angry look in his eyes. "The eternal God made man from the dust of the ground," Abram said, speaking aloud, his voice rising in wrath. "And man defies him to his face with these false gods of wood and stone? Woe to my father and this wicked generation, whose hearts are all inclined to vanity! You, Khaldim, who are worshipped as gods by my father and his people, you have mouths but cannot speak. You have eyes but cannot see. You have ears but cannot hear. You have hands but cannot feel. You have legs but cannot move. You are all vain, hollow, and impotent. and so are all that worship you." Suddenly, Abram swung the axe back and brought it down upon a wooden statue of Shivani. There was a loud thump as the duck-billed bronze head of the axe dug deep into the wood. With strength outside that of mortal man, Abram drew the axe from Shivani and brought it down to the floor, where it broke with an awful crash. A wide sweep of the axe sent a dozen little images off the altar and crashing into the floor. With another swing, he severed the head off of Shivani, then followed through with another swing that drove an image of stone down to the floor with a mighty crash. Over and over he swung the axe, and again the statues shattered, small and large, until the inhabitants of the god house were reduced to a pile of splinters and broken stone. Only Khaldi was left, the largest statue in the center. Not out of any reverence or respect that Abram might have for it, but for a greater purpose. He had heard what Haran, his brother, had muttered under his breath about it not being the way it works. This would be the beginning of his ministry, the work that Noah, Shem, and Heber could not do. He would lay their gods in the dust, have them prove with their own mouths the inefficacy of their gods, and lead them at last to the eternal God. His actions had not gone unnoticed. The hacking and crashing had resounded all throughout the house, and Terah had been the first to hear the noise, who was not of the servants. At once he hurried to the house of the gods and found his second-born Abram standing amid a pile of rubble. Behind him was the statue of Khaldi, a duck-billed axe, lying prostrate across its lap. "What is the meaning of this?" Terah demanded, his voice filled with wrath. "What have you done to my gods?" Abram turned about, a smile upon his face. "My lord father, a wonderful thing has happened this evening." "A wonderful thing?" an incredulous Terah retorted. "An evil thing! Oh, that we had surrendered you to the sword of Nimrod when you were a babe. You dishonor me with your blasphemy against the gods." "Do you mean this?" Abram asked, gesturing to the ruin behind him. "Not so, my lord. I only came here to offer savory meat before them. Behold, it lies here still. No sooner had I placed it before them, but they all stretched out to eat before the largest one put forth its hand. And he was angry at that, and took the axe and broke them all. Behold, it is still in his hand, as you can see." "Do you mock your father with your lies?" Terah retorted. "Do spirits dwell within these images? Or do these gods have power to do as you have said? They are but wood and stone, the product of these two hands." He held forth his hands towards Abram. "It is you who have done this, and broken them with the axe, and placed it in Khaldi's hands to say he smote them all." "How then can you worship these gods of wood and stone?" Abram asked. "They could not even deliver themselves from my hand, yet you pray to them. Can what you have made with your own hands deliver you? Can stone hear your prayers? Can wooden images deliver you from your enemies, or fight your battles for you?" With that, he took the axe from Khaldi's lap, and, using the wooden pole, pushed it down into the ruin of the other images. "It is not good for you or the sons of man who are known to you to do these things, my lord. Have you not heard? Have you not understood? Has it not been told you from the beginning that the eternal God made the heavens and the earth, and all the sons of men, even you and I? Are you a silly and vain, foolish person, void of understanding? Did not our fathers in the days of old do likewise, making gods for themselves in defiance of their Creator, and were destroyed by the great flood for their wickedness? Would you and all this generation continue to provoke the eternal God to bring his judgment upon you?" Terah said nothing, but slowly made his way out of the room that formerly had been the house of the gods. Abram put the axe down among the ruin and ran after his father, imploring him to put away all the idols and remember the eternal God. But Terah would have none of it. What his son had done in his house was inexcusable. To him, it was an insult to his gods, and an affront to the hospitality which he had shown him. In the fullness of his wrath, he had made a rash decision. Even while they were departing, the others of the house entered upon the shambles of their gods, with Haran at the lead, the words of his brother still ringing clearly in his ears. The story continues in chapter 8.